Well, welcome. First of all, buonasera, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Fabiola Tosi, and I'm the Assistant Director of Programs at the Italian Cultural Institute of Chicago. Tonight, we continue with the third lecture of a series presented by Professor Giovanni Aloi, which is part of this year's program Le Voci della Natura, Ecologies and Nature in Italian Arts. Which is the leading theme of our program in 2022. Our goal is to reflect on how nature has been presented in the arts and how artists and intellectuals have gained awareness on nature preservation and climate change. For this lecture, Giovanni will discuss the work of Giuseppe Penone, thinking about the relationship of the body and the natural environment. After the lecture, we'll have time for some questions. So feel free to write them anytime in the Q&A tab, which is at the bottom of your screen. Many of you already know him, but it doesn't hurt to reiterate. Giovanni Aloi is an author, educator, and curator specializing in the representation of nature in art. He has published with Columbia University Press, Phaidon, MIT, Laurence King, and Prestel. He has contributed to BBC radio programs, worked at Whitechapel Art Gallery and Tate Galleries in London. He's a USA correspondent for Esse Magazine and a regular public speaker at the Art Institute of Chicago. Aloi has curated exhibitions in the US and in Europe. He currently teaches modern and contemporary art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York and London. So I will leave the mic to Giovanni and we'll be back for some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabiola, and thank you all for attending today. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite artists of all time. I have to say that when it comes to Giuseppe Penone, the term pioneer really fits perfectly the notion of the relationship between nature and culture and how contemporary art can help us to understand what we need to reconfigure, how we need to rethink our relationship with nature and culture. Fabiola, I just wanted to check before I move on that we can see the screen of the presentation.
Yes, we do.
Fine. Somehow for some reason I don't see the green frame around the selected.
No, we can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so I should begin. For those of you who don't know Giuseppe Penone, he is a quintessential unconformist artist in a number of ways. He was born in Garresio, a small town close to Turin in Piedmont in 1947. And he studied at the Academy of the Beaux-Arts in Turin. Of course, his very early experimentations in the field of art, contemporary art of the time, are linked to Arte Povera. Arte Povera is one of the most important movements in the history of the West. It is, of course, an important chapter, an incredibly important chapter in the history of Italian art, but it is also an extremely influential movement across the spectrum in contemporary art. I actually remember truly understanding how influential Arte Povera has been over the past 60 years, only when I moved to London in the late 90s and realized how famous it was abroad. It's a classic of Italian culture where we don't actually have a rounded understanding of what's really well known and appreciated abroad. And sometimes we underestimate the influence of what Italy has contributed to the cultural international scene. I remember a beautiful exhibition at Tate dedicated to Arte Povera that really mapped important territory in that context of international influence. And you will remember that Arte Povera was an incredible movement, a rejection, substantial rejection of the tradition of classical art that, of course, I think it makes perfect sense to think about Italy, its heritage, what country, what reality, creative reality, more than Italy, could have produced a movement that rejected the classical notion of materiality as well as aesthetics as Arte Povera. So works like the kind that Alighiero Boetti began to make in the early 1970s involving the postal service, or for instance, the work of Michelangelo Pistoletto with the very famous rugs. I think this is a quintessential work in that negotiation, contemporary negotiation between the effigy of classical art, the balance, the harmony, the aspirational quality of classical art, and this mountain of rugs that represents the messiness of reality, the messiness of everyday life as it is, and also the subtle juxtaposition between, you know, the very regal and pure cloth that Venus carries with her, that is about decorum, it's about the dignity of humanity, and this pile of mess that almost smothers her elegance. So Arte Povera has always pushed the boundaries, relatively short-lived as a movement, as some of you might remember. It runs from 1969 to 1972. And the quintessential trademark, of course, was the use of poor materials, as Arte Povera implies, poor art, in search of a new negotiation between ourselves and reality, in the acknowledgement that the economic boom that was experienced in Italy following the end of the Second World War had left a void, a cultural gap, a sense of alienation in the face of a country that was changing perhaps too rapidly, but not quite in the way that it was foreseen. The urbanization, the fast urbanization of Italy following the Second World War is central to the aesthetics and to the questions that Arte Povera poses. This is also how Arte Povera is extremely pioneering, in the sense that he asks questions about ecology and nature and the dichotomy between nature and culture in ways that had not been asked before. Many of you will remember the art critic Germano Celand, who theorized Arte Povera, literally cherry-picking some of the artists that became quintessential to the movement, some of which we have just seen in this slide. In 1967, he published the manifesto of Arte Povera that you see here on the influential magazine Flash Art. And in this piece, he talks about the rejection of Arte Povera from the American influence of pop art and its emphasis on the serial and mass-produced, the rejection of conformism, the rejection of expensive materials that are durable because they play into a market logic that ultimately smothers true creativity in art, the rejection of categories and binaries, or at least the desire to unsettle them, and of course, the search for a new reality, a new relationality that can be more real. And that is the problem. What is the real of Arte Povera? What do Arte Povera artists look for when they begin to engage with materials, materialities, and aesthetics that are, in a sense, uncharted, that play with the notion of the work of art by deconstructing it and reassembling it as something that is very different from the affirmative essence of classical works of art. So it is impossible to look at the work of Giuseppe Penone in a kind of overview style or comprehensive way. And in all honesty, I wouldn't want to do that anyway, because that's not what I do. You can all access interesting documentaries or overviews of the artist's work and get a sense of how he engaged with nature. I have to say that most often I am left somewhat dissatisfied with general overviews of the artist's work, because there seems to be a kind of typical art historical tiptoeing around the real notion that Giuseppe Penone is addressing, which is existentialist in essence. It's not just a discursive reconfiguration. There is a question that it's deeper at the bottom of his practice, that is the result of an alienation that Giuseppe Penone is very aware of, and that is one of the very early artists to devote his practice to. Just remember how art history over centuries, starting from the 17th century, has deliberately sidelined and demoted nature as a subject not worthy of focus and engagement. To dedicate your career from the very word go, from the very beginning, as an up and coming artist and say, actually, I don't care about what art historians have set, the rules of the game that art history has played and that artists have followed for a few hundred years, can be upturned. And I think that's one of the strengths of Giuseppe Penone, is that commitment. So in the context of this presentation, I'd like to explore selected works through the lenses of ecological mythologies. Ecological mythologies are an idea that I am developing in my own writing that departs and relies upon the theorization of William Ruckert in his essay, Literature and Ecology, an experiment in eco-criticism, that was published in 1996. In his essay, Ruckert argues that ecological concepts can be applied to reading, teaching, and writing about literature in order to produce what he refers to as literary ecology. For him, poems, as well as other artworks, are the equivalent of fossil fuels, stored energy. And this applies to many different cultural artifacts. But I take some of his idea and actually shift it slightly. To me, the importance of ecological mythologies doesn't turn artworks into fossil fuel, but it turns them into fossil stratifications, into strata of cultural sedimentations that fossilize over time, that become unchangeable and present in discourses. And the mythologies part of the ecological mythologies is very important to me because I see it in the work of Giuseppe Penone. I see how mythologies have always been important in human culture to explain phenomena beyond the scientific realm. Think about Greek mythology, for instance, ways in which we acknowledge the poetic agency in the world. In other words, mythologies are an acknowledgement that matter is not in earth, and that non-human beings also have agency and that they define our lives. They are interfaces that attempt to explain phenomena, experiences, perceptual iterations of our position in the world. There are ways in which we can understand phenomena and life on this planet. So there is something really powerful about mythologies. But of course, they can become the scaffold and structure around which our sense of participation in the world is also manifested. And yet, Western mythologies tend to anthropomorphize natural sources. And at some point, they suffocate them. Penone's work tends to renegotiate this anthropomorphic mythologization by positioning himself and his practice in a way that more carefully respects the natural world, respects the non-human, so not to smother it, so not to obliterate it, with the centrality of the human that, of course, in classical mythology is typical of the anthropocentrism of humanism. So the other strength of ecological mythologies is that they can be personal. And I think that that's another important factor in the way in which Penone articulates his practice. This idea of the personal and how I, as an individual connected to other individuals, connected to environments, can craft new mythologies that are not necessarily part of a tradition that's been handed down to me, because we know that that tradition is ultimately, in a certain sense, flawed. But how can I craft a new mythology in which I am present, in which I don't always have to pass on the mic to Venus or another deity that has become an institution? So a lot of what I see in Giuseppe Penone's practice revolves around this personal negotiation. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of what the artist addresses at the beginning of his career is linked to the very notions of seeing and touching, because those are the empirical tools we have at our disposal in order to make sense of the natural world. But of seeing, Penone says that sight is a convention. And of course, when he says that sight is a convention, Penone is referring to the tradition of Western scientific knowledge, the empirical system, the prominence and predominance of sight that we see taking place and shaping knowledge across Europe during the 17th and 18th century. Now, this primacy of sight, as we know, has been criticized and critiqued as limiting. This is a slippery slope. Of course, scientific knowledge is extremely important. We don't want to dismiss the importance of scientific knowledge. And for reasons that were intrinsic to the modality of epistemology, the creation, the production of knowledge of the 17th and 18th centuries, sight was deemed to be objective. Certainly more objective than, for instance, touch. So in this work, which has become like a seminal icon of Giuseppe Penone's repertoire, rovesciare I propri occhi, which is to turn your eyes inside out, he wears custom-made contact lenses that were made in collaboration with an optician. And they are technically mirrors. They reflect the image the artist would have seen while rendering the artist blind. In a sense, they are a metaphor to the production of knowledge itself. For something that we see, we remain blind to other aspects that are unseen. And it is in this context that Penone begins to subvert notions of objectivity and subjectivity. What we see reflected in the eyes of the artist as they are occluded by the lenses could be what the artist should have seen, but no longer is what the artist is seeing right now as he wears his lenses. In a sense, this conception brings us to the very root of epistemology, an epistemology that in the West has made us blind to nature itself, has diminished nature to the point that it becomes uninteresting, has diminished the non-human to the point that it allows us, by implication, to claim superiority over it. It is in this context of sight as a convention that touch becomes essential in the practice of Giuseppe Penone, not necessarily as a replacement to sight, but as a complement. Touching something, according to Penone, is a confirmation. Touching something is a much more intimate and, of course, less objective way to develop knowledge of something else. In this work, the forest engraves the imprint of growth. You can see how the artist's fingerprints become the base of what then turns into the trunk of a tree. And it is in very early works such as these from 1969, so we're at the very beginning of what puts Penone on the map as an Arte Povera artist, that we begin to see this interesting overlap, which problematizes the dichotomy of nature and culture, as well as, I think, actively problematizing some conceptions that are very important today about the reconfiguring of anthropocentrism. When you think about it, in a sense, the fingerprint could be seen as thoroughly anthropocentric. There is so much ingrained in our fingerprint. And yet, Penone is not rejecting entirely the human. His desire to renegotiate implies the presence of the human. And I think in this conception, he is very much ahead of his time and very much contemporary. It makes me think of the conversations that over time developed in the context of animal studies in the humanities, or considerations that are still taking place in the field of the environmental humanities. And in this case, you can see his acceptance that ultimately perception is linked and hardwired in us. For as much as we try and aim to decenter the human, what we see is seen by us. What we can say about the non-human is still said mostly by us. And I say mostly because in the work of Giuseppe Penone, we find an interesting negotiation between us and materiality that ultimately invites a reconsideration that never leaves anything behind. The human, what we call nature, and that space in which the negotiations happens. So to Giuseppe Penone, the trace, the fingerprint, has an animal quality, which is really interesting. He says the animal image, that's what he calls this imprint. The imprint is involuntary culture. It has the intelligence of the material, a universal intelligence, an intelligence of the flesh of the material of man. The imprint of the whole epidermis of one's body, a leap into the air, a plunge into the water, the body covered with earth, developing one's skin against the air, water, earth, rock, walls, and so on. There is something extremely poetic and very intimate about this journey that Giuseppe Penone begins in the late 60s, and that remains the backbone of his practice up until today. He's still alive and kicking, producing amazing work. And this idea of negotiation is extremely important. In this work, which is called Propagazione, which translates into propagation, we see the continuity between the thumbnail that you can see in the middle of the composition. This is the thumbnail of the artist, and waves that depart from it. Of course, at a glance, and knowing as well Giuseppe Penone's body of work, we could assume that these are the concentrical circles that we see in the section of a tree. So again, Giuseppe Penone is trying to find a point of contact in which the identity of the tree, that as we know is ingrained into the concentrical circles, is unique to each tree, because of course, the circles are defined by a number of variables that are never just reducible to the growth of the tree itself. And the same applies to our fingerprints. So Giuseppe Penone started this work with his thumb, and then he tries to extend each line at the same width of his thumb in order to create a reverberation, a sense of growth. The waves could also be understood to be sound waves in water, perhaps, reaching out. They are biomorphic, abstract, and yet they remain figurative because in them we still see the circular repetition that is typical of natural entities like trees or waves upon water. They are diagrams of the passing of time. Diagrams of the passing of time according to a natural blueprint rather than a clock. So the question of time has been ingrained in nature itself. And Giuseppe Penone also works with gold most often. And I know some of you might be thinking, what does gold have to do with the idea of Arte Povera? Well, Arte Povera planted the seed of Giuseppe Penone's work, the conception. Then, of course, Giuseppe Penone plays with materiality, especially later on in his career, and with the notion of permanency and value in ways that expand from the initial strictures of Arte Povera itself. Of course, in this case, in the notion of gold is a notion of life. There's a primordial link to the spirituality that is so important in the tradition of gold and that we find across the history of medieval art, spread across Europe and extending all the way into the East. The idea of the human and nature, the touch, the idea of working directly. There's intimacy at place here. And we see this in early works such as these, which entail touching, which entail manipulating and engaging, as well as negotiating space with nature outside the gallery. Now, as a broader context, I want to remind you about the rise of land art in the United States. We've talked about pop art and how Arte Povera is resisting those cliches of pop art in America. But there's also a sense that Penone engages with certain ideas that we have explored in the United States during the 1960s, but his approach cannot be aligned with the monumental and sublime gestures of Walter de Maria, for instance, or Robert Smithson. There is an intimacy and a smallness here that is dictated by the presence of his body in space. And we're going to explore this a little bit more. You can see that Giuseppe Penone's gesture, you see him here weaving together three young trees so that they will grow together and meshed into each other, is much more intimate and is much more quiet. There is something that it's more pensive. That's something that, in a sense, it's less patriarchal, less masculine. The gestures are not about subjugating nature by opening a canyon in the land or reconfiguring a spiral jetty so that it changes the ecology of the bay in which it now is situated. Giuseppe Penone seems to be more respectful. And yet, within this respect, there is the undeniable force, defining force of the human. In this seminal work, we find a representation of man's ability to constrict nature, perhaps. It can be read in many different ways. Man's dependency to nature can also be inscribed in this work. The reminder of not letting go, or the impossibility of not letting go. That for as much as we like to kid ourselves that nature is a backdrop, that is just a construction that ultimately prevents us from understanding our true position within the planet, an understanding that is costing us dearly today as we face almost irreversible climate change. Or the notion of time as a material that defines both nature and human intervention, the idea of growth. There is something about plants and their entwinement with time. There is a history that it's indissoluble between the two. And it's a history of being present. Plants can be present in ways that humans can no longer be present. It's what ontologically, if you like, separates them in their experiencing of the world. And there is, of course, in this work also embedded the ability of nature to circumvent and to relentlessly engulf and swallow and transform whatever it finds in its path. So while initially it might seem to us that in this work, it's the human presence that ultimately constricts and defines, in time, it is the tree that will find ways to expel the human or incorporate it, engulf it, rather than become a passive object of it. In this relationship of touching, in this relationship of engagement, Penone also reinvents and reconfigures the notion of mimesis as postulated in classical art, from a measure with reality, a confrontation with reality, to a tool through which we can understand reality. So he replaces the heroic idea of the artist as God, emulating the creation of God, with the idea of the artist who tries to understand nature through its processes and through the processes of art itself. To better understand the challenge, we need to return to one of the most famous stories that it's usually recounted in the 101 art history classes at all art schools in the West. The myth of Zeuxis and Tharasius, the two very famous artists, painters from the 4th century BCE. Unfortunately, none of their works has survived to us, so we can just imagine that their quintessential skill was mimesis, because as the myth recounts, the two engaged in a competition that, according to Pliny the Elder, entailed painting something in the uttermost realism. It is said that Zeuxis painted grapes that were so realistic that birds saw the image and flew down to attempt to eat them. You see them here coming in through the window. And shortly after, he then went to view Parrhasius' painting that was exhibited opposite and asked that the curtain in front of it be lifted so that he could look at the image, only to discover that the curtain was itself the painting. So Zeuxis acknowledged his defeat because while he had tricked birds, the curtain of Parrhasius had deceived a man, a fellow artist. So in this story, you see a hierarchy. I would actually assume that deceiving birds is a much greater accomplishment than deceiving another artist. But what this myth tells us is that classical art is grounded on this deceit, on this confrontation between artist and God. A confrontation that we know it's not consumed on a worship of reality. While at a glance, or a desire to understand the natural world as reality. While at a glance, we look at these beautiful sculptures and we think that they represent the human body in anatomically correct ways. It has been proved over and over that that's not the case. the anatomy of this body is adjusted according to the proportional rules that dictated the beauty of classical art, the golden ratio. So to Giuseppe Penone, mimesis is not a confrontation with the divine. And he demonstrates this in a work that I'm going to show you in a second, of which he says that to remove a stone from the river and to return to the source of the river in order to find that stone and to work through as a sculptor, to remodel the stone itself like the river did over years. To him, that means to produce a perfect sculpture, a sculpture that returns into nature and that becomes of cosmic importance. It's a really interesting concept that we see here. Now, one of the two stones is lifted from the river. The other is sculpted to look as close as possible to the stone that was naturally shaped by the river, but it's shaped by the artist. The purpose of this mimesis is not to confront himself with God and to excel, but is actually to try and understand what it's like to become the river, if possible. And of course, there's a speculative element here that it's extremely contemporary. Those of you who are keen on speculative realism or speculative approaches in philosophy can recognize this impossibility. We will never know what it's like to be a river. But what a cliche would it be to imagine that being a river has to do with being wet, right? That it has to do with water. I think that's one of the most powerful things Penone accomplishes, is to make us think about a process that the river accomplishes in ways that are not necessarily conscious in a way that human beings are conscious or other animals are conscious, and that nonetheless is the work of the river. It's a dialogue between the river and the stone that the artist is attempting to tune into and to get as close as possible as that could get. Now we see this notion of mimesis as process reverberate to a number of iconic works, like this one, To Repeat the Forest. This is, again, one of my favorite works. I remember seeing it at Tate many years ago. And, this is one of those that requires a lot of attention. From a distance, you just think, okay, the artist cut a tree and glued it to a pedestal. And that's not what happens here. In fact, the process is a slow process of carving from a beam that once upon a time was a tree and that it's been turned into a beam. So the transformation between tree and beam, by essence, incorporates notions of capitalism and industrialization. You will remember that I mentioned earlier that Arte Povera emerges from the sense of alienation of a fast-changing Italy, where urbanization and industrialization seem to be wiping away an identity, losing ground in a conception of what our essence is, just as quickly as the territory is being changed. And this new conception of nature is what Penone is trying to negotiate here. The dichotomy of nature and culture, as it's been handed down to us from classical art, no longer stands, is no longer attainable. So there's an impossibility of reversing perhaps our processes of the rationalization of nature. Or maybe there's a desire for that process to take place, to recover, to return. There's a poetic engagement with the notion of repeating. And again, there is a notion of time sculpting these works. Penone is studying the surface of the beam to identify knots that lead the artist back into a tree that once was, as closely as possible, and yet not just subjugating his practice, his process, to reproducing the tree exactly the way it was. The tree is an interpretation. It's in this context that Giuseppe Penone says, I don't want to modify the material, I want to follow it. These are sentences that could come out of the mouth of contemporary artists working and engaging with these subjects today. Giuseppe Penone is, in a sense, an incredible pioneer because he is already mapping here ideas and concepts that are now central to artists who work in the context of new materialism. And you can argue that a lot of what Arte Povera put on the map with this desire to engage with poor materials can be contextualized retrospectively in the framework of new materialism. In this desire not to subjugate material to do what the artist wants, but to engage with the material into a dialogue and see what the material has to say, in the knowledge that the material is always saying something, unless we mute the material deliberately and intentionally, because our conception of ourselves as artists is to dominate, is to subjugate. So you can see again this negotiation of positioning, the body of the artist, the gesture, the touching, the negotiation of a conversation that may reconfigure the dichotomy between nature and culture. You can see when you approach Ripetere il Bosco in the base, in the liminal space between the pedestal and the emergence of the tree, that there is no severance, there is no gluing, there is no rupture. The two are seamlessly connected. And this connection between nature and culture, this attempt not to reject the dichotomy, but to accept it as a continuity that, if played in a certain way, doesn't smother nature, but contributes to the natural growth of the human, is central to Giuseppe Penone's proposal. Some of you might remember that in 1999, it's the last century, there was a devastating storm that ravaged the gardens in Versailles. Winds blowing at 130 miles an hour fell more than 10,000 trees. Now, Giuseppe Penone is also very sensitive to the sites in which he installs his work and the context in which he produces work. And it was at this time that he actually decided to purchase one of the largest trees that fell at the time in order to engage in this dialogue that reconsidered the present and the past, what we as humans can and cannot experience about nature. There is a limit to the epistemology of science when it's based on the gaze, on sight, that renders certain things invisible, as we said earlier. And you can see how Giuseppe Penone's practice is archaeological sometimes. That's why I like to think about the ecological mythologies as stratifications of fossils. Penone is engaged in an excavation through carving. You can see him at work here, a careful carving of something that at a glance might appear to be just a different temporal dimension, but it's actually something a lot more complicated. The excavation might be happening on a non-human, on something we identify as natural, but it's truly an excavation in our relationship with nature, looking for something, a point of contact, a moment of connection that goes well beyond the traditional separation between nature and culture. So this idea of proximity, this idea of touching, this idea of getting closer returns through works like Scrigno, that translates into casket, where indexicality plays a central role in Penone's project. In this case, what we see on the wall, it's not bark. Penone is not interested in presenting us what we can already see in nature for what it is, because we can see that. He's interested in the negotiation. So in this case, he actually used leather to hammer a tree in order to retain the imprint of the tree itself. Again, engaging in negotiations of what's visible and invisible, what's inside and outside, reversing and confounding the two. The actual casting process, the casting process that it's so essential to the foundation of classical Greek and Roman art, is re-envisioned by Giuseppe Penone into a practice in which the cast is not necessarily lost, is not discarded as a tool, but becomes part of the sculpture itself. As a process of seeing, as a process of understanding and mapping of space and bodies that otherwise remain objectified by the gaze of science. This is a process that once again began a long time ago, at the beginning of Arte Povera, in the late 60s. This work is now lost. This was also part of the deliberate carelessness, lack of preciousness of the works of Arte Povera. This was a real tree that was cut and that was covered by Giuseppe Penone with wax, little bits of wax applied across the whole of the surface, bit by bit, in order to map the years of the tree, which are of course inside the bark, plus one. The challenge of the artist was to create a thin enough layer of wax that covered the entirety of the trunk so that it would add a year in the life of the tree, that it's added onto it by the artist, and that could never happen because of course the tree is already dead. You can see in this gesture a sense of closeness, proximity, and continuation, again, between the tree and the practice, the approach of the artist. Again, a very delicate, measured, careful application of wax, which references the processes of classical art without leaving behind the original. You know, you can cast anything. Those of you who are artists know what casting does inside out. You know, you can cast pretty much any object, and you cover it in a grease of some kind that will prevent the layers of gesso from adhering to it too much, but will allow it to adhere close enough for it to capture the essence of the object. And then when you open up the shape that has been created around it, you're left with a hollow imprint of the object itself. In classical art, once you're done creating copies and copies of the object you've cast, the cast is lost. The original object can be lost as well. Giuseppe Penone preserves as much as possible. So this work in 2008, which is called Spazio di Luce, which translates into the space of light, is a reference, a deliberate reference to the 1969 work I just showed you, The Years of the Tree. And in this case, the artist returns to that idea 44 years later as a 2012 Bloomberg commission at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, where I had the opportunity to work in the early 2000s when I lived in London. Spazio di Luce is a cast bronze that, as you can see, you might be able to see, reproduces the surface of the bark of a tree. In this case, Giuseppe Penone applied wax to the bark of the tree, as he did in 1969, but then removed the wax as it hardened, using it to create this new surface, a new surface in which the outside of the tree no longer is its bark. If you see this work more closely, you can actually see the artist's fingerprints all over it. This is the side that he molded with his hands. The bark, the imprint of the bark, is now inside the tree itself. So there is a reversal, a reinvention of the classical casting process in which an understanding and a new knowledge of the tree is produced. This tree was encountered by the artist. It was already fallen and cut into sections. And it's when he began to assemble these new casts that he decided to allow it to stand the way you see here. Because to him, it charged the tree with an agency that blurred its vegetal boundaries. It almost turned it into an animal, a creature that is actually capable of more than plants might seem capable of to us. There is something interesting about this notion of light that Giuseppe Penone communicates through gold as well. It becomes, in a certain sense, animistic in the context of some of these sculptures. The light that the tree absorbs, that it's so essential to its life, becomes assimilated, processed within it in order to perpetuate the life of the tree itself. So this is a monumentalization of the tree, if you like. But it's a monumentalization of the tree that always acknowledges the perception from which it comes. The perception is human, and it's inscribed all over the outer surface, which records the imprints, the fingerprints of the artist. A very recent project by Giuseppe Penone that closed in January this year took place at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And it's, again, an opportunity for Giuseppe Penone to strengthen this idea that nature and culture not only are not mutually exclusive, but the two can be seen as intrinsically productive. In the display in the gallery at the library, Giuseppe Penone proceeded to use the technique of frottage, in which you apply a piece of paper or fabric to the surface of an object and then rub it with some pigment in order to capture its texture. In this case, Penone rubbed a 30 meters tall acacia tree with some vegetal pigment. You can see how this is a desire, again, to acknowledge the process of learning and creating an imprint, which is specific to a tree, which then becomes surrounded, embedded, as you see here, in words. Because of course, the tree itself is words. Think about the history of books, the history of writing in the West, and how rarely we think about books as plants. And yet, they are. How different would the history of humankind be if trees had not allowed us to spread our knowledge and disseminate it and access it at will through books? So here we see in this alberi libro, there are book trees that are also exhibited, that were also exhibited in the show at the library, really reinstating that notion, the continuity that's bound in the materiality of books. And for those of you who have not visited the library in Paris, it's just an incredible environment. I remember the first time I saw it many years ago. It's astonishing. It's one of those places you stumble upon and can't, you have to pinch yourself to make sure it's real. As you look down and see this beautiful forest right in the middle of the building, you're reminded about this very intimate relationship between trees, human knowledge, book, words. There's something that cannot be left behind in this effort, in this production of knowledge. So this continuation between nature and culture, this negotiation, is something that we see at times in Giuseppe Penone, arcing back to classical materials like marble and bronze. These are trees that were created by the artist to be situated outside the Fendi Foundation in Rome. And you can see how enormous blocks of marble that are supported by the trees, again, the trees are supporting our cultural production, implicitly return us to classical art, but they also return us to a biomorphic continuity between our veins, the branches of trees, structures of importance that are found in our bodies and in their bodies, in the architectures that have defined classical art and the mythologies of classical art, as well as the identities that we carry with us today. Even here in the United States, as I look around me, classical art still dominates as the quintessential institutional language. And you can see here Giuseppe Penone attempting to negotiate and trace back, bring to the fore this connection. I was, I will be, I am not. The contradictions that are intrinsic to this continuity. So with Giuseppe Penone, we are empowered as individuals, and that is like my hope that I see in the work that any of you can take away from experiencing his work. It's this personal empowerment that we're all ultimately in charge of defining ecological mythologies that can be ours and that can allow us as individuals to reconnect to nature in ways that are wholly personal, perhaps even quirky and strange, but that can reclaim that distance, can fill that distance that science, scientific knowledge created with the prominence of the gaze in ways that are more personal. In this project that brings us back to the beginning of Giuseppe Penone's career, you can see how the artist uses the measure of his body in order to configure a frame. And of course, a frame is such an important symbol in the history of Western art, because the frame separates what's inside from what is outside. And it's being used as an emblem of the separation between nature and culture. And here you see the frame, which represents the presence of Giuseppe Penone's body in space, being immersed, violated by the river, by the water that it's ultimately impossible to contain. But you see his presence symbolized and magnified as an absence that nonetheless is not irrelevant. The measure that Penone inserts in the landscape, it's not a measure of subjugation, it's an existentialist question. It's a question that brings us back to our relationship with nature, what we have missed and what can be reclaimed through levels of intimacy that we can craft once again. This is the last work I want to briefly share with you tonight, and it's called Soffio di foglie, which is breath of leaves. And it's a floor sculpture of myrtle leaves that Giuseppe Penone started to stage in 1979 and still restages today. As you can see, it's a mound of leaves upon which he lays. And of course, as you can imagine, he doesn't spend the entirety of the exhibition laying down flat on these leaves. He turns to one side and he sighs across the leaves in order to create space across them. And the resulting work is this imprint of the body of the artist. Again, the presence and the absence, the notion of life and death, the notion of the passing of time, and a trace that once again is not the intrusive and aggressive trace of land art of the 1960s in America, but it's a subtle trace. It's a trace that doesn't damage the environment. It's a trace that is temporary. And as such, it's connected to memory, but not in the sense of the monumentalization of memory, as in the heroic memory of, look what I have accomplished. Posterity will remember me looking at this. What we see here is a form of writing with nature and through nature that rejects notions of permanence and that embraces the fluidity, that embraces the becoming, the passing, the instability of natural processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. My thoughts, of course. I kind of wanted to start it, from this kind of long thought that I formulated in my mind throughout the lecture. I think as you were going through the different works, it was, changing and shifting. And I was thinking a lot about the things that, you showed us in the previous lectures too, and sort of trying to bring everything together. And so overall, I feel like there is this almost like dichotomy, or like two ways in which we have seen nature represented that sort of come together also in Penone's work. So first, when you started the lecture, I was thinking about this idea that we saw in Giri's photos as well, of the negotiation of the human presence in nature that happens by sort of almost like putting aside the human presence in the natural world, right? And so the first thought was, do we, or does the artist need to set aside the human presence to be able to truly represent nature as subject and not just as an object of the work? But then when we were going through all the different works, it seemed that Penone more and more was trying not to take out the human body from representation, but he felt more a sort of almost smudging of the human body inside the natural world. And that made me think, for example, of what we saw in Ligabue, where nature became not separate, but something that is integrated, or in which the human is integrated. And so we return to this idea that we sort of lost, especially like in our contemporary living, that we are actually part of this nature. And that made me think again about this idea of the negotiation that Penone does in his work as well. So the big question would be, how is nature best represented as center? Is it when the human body is taken out of the picture, or is it when we integrate ourselves in it. And in a way, that's also the question that we can ask ourselves in the way that we approach ecology and climate change. Does nature thrive when we are not there? Or does nature thrive when we are really integrated? And so right now we're just not. So do you think like Penone gets to a conclusion in this sense, or is it still an open question in his work?
It's a wonderful summarization of some of the main threads we've explored in the past few lectures. Thank you so much for that, Fabiola. I think there isn't a definitive answer. And one of the things I've actually enjoyed with my research, with different artists, is to notice how this question of the positioning of the body is an open question, in the sense that artists address it in very different ways. For many years, I have been very resistant to anthropomorphism. And I have to also acknowledge that tonight, those of you who are familiar with the broader body of work of Giuseppe Penone may have noticed that I have deliberately left out some of the works in which he includes faces in more kind of representative ways. And I think, to me, there is something interesting about a certain tension that he's capable of creating when the trace is present, like the fingerprint or other kind of interactions, for instance, with the leaves and the breath, than the representation of the human. So we have a kind of like slight misalignment there in the purpose, the intention, and what that proximity and engagement and negotiation with nature entail. Personally, I become more excited when I don't need to see a human face in a work of art in which the human and nature come together in a negotiation. But some artists still find that interesting. In the concept of a comparison between Giri, for instance, and what Giri was accomplishing and what Penone accomplishes, I think Giri is more documenting a matter of fact. Like Giri is more concerned with getting to the bottom of this existentialist tension that is linked to alienation, but he's not suggesting how to solve it. Or how can we, there is also a slippery slope in this idea of solving things. Because I am not sure that Penone is actually giving us a recipe to get us out of this issue of alienation. We are certainly alienated from nature. Giri shows us the alienation as it expresses itself in the suburbia, Italian suburbia of the Second World War period, with these pots that look awkward, set on steps, or these like small trees that look suffocated by the architecture around them. What we saw in Ligabue's paintings is this possibility to empathize with animals and with the laws of nature in ways that have been impossible for other artists who come from a trained background. And I think with Penone, we see another opportunity, another avenue. I think every artist is carving a path into this journey out of the alienation, or acknowledging the alienation as an early step. I think one of the important things to remember too is that Giri was very earlier on. We're dealing with pioneers here. And I think Giri was much more interested in evidencing the alienation almost with humor as an anthropological project. While Penone is very pioneer, is a true pioneer in the sense that he's trying to overcome the alienation. He's so much more contemporary. I don't know that today the Giri approach would really speak to contemporary audiences as enough. It certainly was focusing on a problem and evidencing it in the 70s, between 1972 and 1974. Now, I think artists are really trying to reposition themselves in a way that, to me, seems to be more similar to what Penone has been doing since the 70s. And you know, as I talk, and I don't want to take up all the time, but there's another artist that's really interesting, Javier Cortada, here in the United States, who has created portraits of diatoms. You know, diatoms are phytoplankton that is invisible and yet extremely important to the ecosystems because they produce oxygen as well as fertilize the land. But nobody knows anything about diatoms outside scientists. They remain overlooked in popular culture. The idea that phytoplankton and diatoms produce 70% of the oxygen on the planet and trees don't is still not apparently common knowledge. But yet, you know, these things are invisible. And the only way in which science has made them visible is with very cold, fabulous, but very cold looking photographs. So the diatoms are forever relegated to this distance. They exist in a scientific world that's forbidden to us, as in personal experience. So what Cortada has done is to create these portraits of diatoms using clay and then glaze them and fire them. And they become these beautiful representations of diatoms that have got no scientific value because they are manipulated by hand in a very kind of like intimate way, like Giuseppe Penone uses the imprint in ways that are personal. But this desire, I think, to connect and to connect firsthand, to connect personally, to connect now, I think it's very, very contemporary, very present in the preoccupation of artists.
Yeah, and I also think that the idea of like looking for solutions in art is not necessarily something that actually belongs to the work of artists. The moment you make art definitive and a solution, it loses that, you know, process of being the place where we try to find challenges and questions and go beyond what's even like sometimes possible and real, depending on, you know, the part of art history that we are looking at.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
Artists are not meant to solve our problems, right?
Right. Right, exactly. I want to get to at least one of the questions that we got from our audience. And there's one from Bill Wells that says, was Penone experiencing the image as a whole or in a dance between objectivity and subjectivity at different rates of being or seeing the whole? So this, you know, contrast between what's objectivity and subjectivity.
I think part of his journey is to try and negotiate this subjectivity construction beyond the traditional conceptions of what those terms entail. So even we see that, not just, I think that the last work, you know, that I showed you, the Soffio di Foglie, is very fascinating because it actually brings us back to this impossibility of seeing and blindness, because he has his head down, right, into the leaves, and the head is tilted just enough so that he can blow through the leaves in order to open this space that then becomes the imprint of his breath. And I think that to me is emblematic of this desire of breaking up the objective subjective. The moment you obliterate the distance, think about science, the visibility of science has always been, let's say the epistemology of science, the creation of knowledge of science, has always relied on the distance. There has to be a certain distance between the observer and the observed in order to produce knowledge that it's objective and verifiable. So even when you think about the microscope, you know, we all played with microscopes at some point in our lives. You know how the structure of the object itself, of the tool, separates our eye from the object being seen. And Penone obliterates that by pushing his face into the leaves. And then the object is no longer the leaves. The object is this moment of impression of the human body that's received into the leaves and the breath, which is all like immaterial in the end, and it's all like temporary. And at the end of the show, will be swept away by a gallery manager and put into a dustbin and then thrown out, you know? So to me, that is the true breaking down of being and seeing and trying to find ways through which that separation, which is the ultimate loss, I understand it's always like a very difficult mapping to challenge science, especially in this time, because we don't want to come off as science deniers. We love science. Science is very important to the production of knowledge, and lots of things that we know have come to us through that production of knowledge that science has articulated. So it's important to reiterate the separation between object and subject is needed for a certain kind of knowledge to emerge. And when I say that, I think about the surgeon, and I think about operations. Think about the lack of this separation between object and subject and what it would do to a heart transplant, right? I don't want my surgeon to dive into me and blow on my heart, But I think our reliance on that epistemological approach as the only epistemological approach that matters in the creation of knowledge about nature has giving us a whole wealth of information and yet impoverished our relationship. We carry that distance with us. It has made us cynical to the point that the distinction between object and subject is all that we have left, and that we feel somewhat inadequate, embarrassed, or even awkward to the point of stupidity in engaging with nature in ways that depart from that subject-object relation. And that's why I wanted to wrap up our consideration of Penone's work with Soffio di Foglia, because there is something, if you like, stupid about that work. The idea of slamming your body into these leaves and just for the purpose of what? Blowing. It's irrelevant, meaningless, and yet it means everything, right? It really captures that deliberate desire to find the contact with all of your body. It's almost like desperate in a sense, in a way that I find extremely poetic. Also in the way that he wants to retain that ephemerality. He wants to acknowledge that whatever moment we have with nature in which we can catch a glimpse of that connection is going to be ephemeral, is going to be bound to the moment.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Giovanni. It was, as always, an inspiring lecture. And we'll see you again on Thursday, May 5th for the fourth of your lectures, Ecological Perspectives in Contemporary Italian Art. And thank you, of course, to everyone who joined us tonight. We do have many initiatives coming up in the next couple of months, especially. So I would encourage everyone to check out our website and subscribe to our newsletter or follow us on social media. We are pretty much everywhere. I also wanted to remind everyone that our membership program is still open, and we have some exclusive initiatives upcoming for all of our members, including free tickets for the concert of Italian group IDR, Italian Doc Remix, which will be at Constellation in Chicago on May 17th. So don't miss our newsletter. You'll receive all the information in the next couple of weeks. You can find a list of additional benefits. There are many for our membership program on our website as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you again, Fabiola. Thank you all for attending.